Good afternoon, everyone. Today I will be presenting my capstone project, the long-term effects of childhood and emotional abuse on emotional regulation, depression, and anxiety in young adults. I chose this topic because emotional abuse is often overlooked since it doesn't leave physical injuries. However, research shows that it can have a lifelong, lasting psychological effects that influence mental health, relationships, and overall well-being. During this presentation, I'll explain what emotional abuse is and how it affects development and what research says about recovery. Let's begin by looking why this topic is so important, which brings us to our next slide, the introduction. Childhood emotional abuse is that when people think of childhood abuse, they usually picture physical or sexual abuse. Emotional abuse is different because the damage isn't visible, which makes it much harder to recognize. Examples may include constant criticism, humiliation, rejection, emotional neglect, and manipulation. Although there might be physical injuries, this experience can shape the way children think about themselves and others for many years to come. Researchers now recognize emotional abuse as adverse childhood experience or ACE in acronym, basically because it's strongly linked to depression, anxiety, and difficulty managing emotions later in their lives. Today, I will summarize what current research tells us about these long-lasting effects. Before discussing the next consequences, that it's important to understand exactly what emotional abuse involves. In our next slide, background of childhood emotional abuse. Childhood emotional abuse refers to repeated behaviors by a caregiver that damage a child's emotional development. This can include verbal insults, constant criticism, rejection, intimidation, emotional neglect, or making a child feel unloved or unimportant. Unlike occasional disagreements or discipline, emotional abuse happens repeatedly over time. This experiences gradually affect self-esteem, confidence, and emotional security. Because there are no visible injuries, many cases go unnoticed, and many survivors don't realize they have experienced emotional abuse until their adulthood. Understanding what emotional abuse is, it will help explain why studying is so important in our next slide. The importance of the topic. This topic is very important because the effects of emotional abuse often continue long after their childhood ends. Research has found that survivors are more likely to experience depression, anxiety, low self esteem, and problems regulating their emotions. These challenges can affect school, career, friendships, and romantic relationships in their later lives. Young adulthood is especially important because it's a time when people become independent, build careers, and form long-lasting relationships. It's also when many mental health disorders first start becoming noticeable. Greater awareness allows professionals to recognize these problems earlier and provide better support. Next, I'll explain the purpose of my capstone project, which brings us to the next slide. The purpose of the study and research questions. The purpose of this capstone was to examine how childhood emotional abuse affects young adults between the ages 18 and 30. Instead of conducting my own research, I reviewed recent peer-reviewed studies to identify common findings. My project focused mainly on four questions. How does emotional abuse affect emotional regulations? What is the relationship with depression? How does it contribute to anxiety? And the last question, which evidence-based treatments are most effective when dealing with this issue? Answering these questions will help us improve our understanding of childhood trauma while identifying proper strategies that promote recovery. To answer these questions, we first need a better understanding of emotional abuse in itself. Understanding childhood emotional abuse. Emotional abuse isn't a single notated event. No, it's an ongoing pattern of behaviors that harms a child's emotional development. Common examples include criticism, humiliation, manipulation, emotional neglect, and isolation. Research also shows that emotional abuse is more common in families experiencing conflict, substance abuse, untreated illness, or financial stress. One interesting finding from the literature is that these long-term effects appear across many different cultures, showing that emotional abuse is a worldwide public health concern rather than an issue limited to a country or a single community. Now, let's compare that with what healthy emotional development would normally look like. Our next slide is normal emotional development. And so, children learn emotional skills through supportive relationships with either their parents or caregivers. When adults respond with patience, encouragement, affection, children develop confidence, emotional regulation, empathy, and healthy coping skills. Another important concept is secure attachment. Children who feel safe and supported are generally better prepared to handle the stress and build healthy relationships in their later lives, including young adulthood. Research also suggests that supportive adults, such as teachers and mentors, can influence emotional development positively, even when children experience certain adversities at homes. So, what happens when that supportive environment is replaced actually by an emotional abuse, which are the ones that we've seen? Which brings us to my next slide: how emotional abuse disrupts development. Emotional abuse interrupts healthy emotional development because instead of feeling accepted and supported, children may constantly expect criticism or rejection. Over time, they often develop low self esteem and begin believing negative things about themselves. These early experiences can make it difficult to trust others, form healthy relationships, and manage emotions during adulthood. To research highlights that something encouraging. The supportive relationships in later life can reduce some of these long-term effects and help individuals build healthier emotional patterns through their later lives. Besides affecting emotions, emotional abuse also changes how the brain responds to certain stress, which is our next slide. Effects on brain development. Childhood is a critical period for brain development, and repeated emotional abuse activates the body's stress response over and over again. Researchers have found that this chronic stress can affect several important brain areas. The amygdala may become more sensitive to fear. The hippocampus may have actually more difficulty processing memories and emotions, and the prefrontal cortex may become less effective at regulating emotions and making decisions. The HPA axis, which controls the body's stress response, can also become dysregulated, increasing the risk of depression and anxiety later in life. These biological changes help explain the psychological theories that I will discuss next. Psychological theories. Several psychological theories help explain why childhood emotional abuse has such lasting effects. Attachment theory suggests that early relationships shape how we trust each other and view ourselves, while cognitive theory explains that repeated emotional abuse creates negative beliefs such as "I'm not good enough." Development psychology shows that trauma interrupts healthy emotional growth during childhood. Finally, behavioral theory suggests that children learn coping strategies like emotional suppression or avoidance, which may continue into adulthood. Together, these theories explain that emotional abuse increases the risk of depression, anxiety, and emotional regulation difficulties. Next, I want to discuss emotional regulation, which is one of the strongest links between childhood emotional problems and later health problems. So let's go to the next one. Emotional regulation, right? Emotional regulation is our ability to recognize, understand, and manage our emotions in healthy ways. It's an important skill because it affects how we handle stress, solve problems, and build relationships. Children usually develop these skills through supportive interactions with parents or caregivers. However, emotional abuse disrupts this learning process, and instead of learning healthy coping strategies, many children just resort to suppress their emotions and react very intensely. Research shows that emotional dysregulation is one of the strongest connections between childhood emotional abuse and later health problems, making it an important focus of treatment. One of those mental health problems is depression, which has appeared consistently through this research. Childhood emotional abuse and depression are next slide. Depression was one of the most common long-term outcomes that I found in the studies that I reviewed, and mainly in the Kaiser Library. Children who experience constant criticism or rejection often develop negative beliefs about themselves. Over time, they may believe they're good enough or that they have very little control over their own lives. These beliefs can continue into adulthood and contribute to symptoms such as sadness, hopelessness, low motivation, fatigue, and loss of interest in their daily life activities. The encouraging news is that evidence based therapies can help individuals change these unhealthy thinking patterns and significantly reduce their depressive symptoms. Along with depression, anxiety is another common long term consequence of emotional abuse. Next slide. Childhood emotional abuse and anxiety. Research has also found that a strong relationship between childhood emotional abuse and anxiety disorder is very connected. Children who grew up in emotional abusive environments often learn to expect criticism or rejection, and as adults, they become overly sensitive to stress and constantly anticipating negative outcomes. Many survivors experience generalized anxiety, social anxiety, or panic symptoms because their brains remain in a heightened state of alertness. Fortunately, therapies that focus on trauma and emotional regulation have been shown to reduce anxiety and improve overall psychological well-being. So, why did this research specifically focus on young adults? That's what I'll explain on my next slide. Why the focus on young adults? Young adulthood between the ages of 18 and 30 is an important period because people begin building careers, becoming independent, and forming long-term relationships. It's also the stage when many health disorders first become clinically significant. For survivors of childhood emotional abuse, these life transitions can be especially challenging because emotional difficulties may interfere with work, education, and relationships. Early identification during this stage can make the treatment more effective and improve the long-term outcomes of it. Research have also discovered that emotional abuse affects more than just thoughts and emotions. It can also influence the brain and the body. Our next slide, biological and neurological effects of childhood abuse. Childhood emotional abuse affects the body stress response system known as the HPA axis. Repeated exposure to stress can increase cortisol levels and make it harder for the body to recover from stressful situations. Researchers have also found that in important brain regions, including the amygdala, hippocampus, and prefrontal cortex, which help regulate fear, memory, decision making, and emotions. One hopeful finding is neuroplasticity. This means that the brain can continue changing through adulthood, allowing people to improve emotional functioning through therapy and supportive relationships. I'm sorry. Although emotional abuse has lasting effects, it doesn't affect everyone in the very same way. Protective factors and resilience is our next slide. Not everyone who experiences childhood emotional abuse develops the same long term difficulties. One reason is resilience, or the ability to adapt and recover from difficult experiences. Research shows that supportive relationships with family members, teachers, mentors, or friends can reduce psychological distress and promote healthier emotional development. Developing healthy coping skills and receiving professional therapy at times can also increase resilience and improve long term mental health outcomes. These findings naturally lead into the treatments that have been shown to actually help survivors properly recover. Which brings us to the next slide, evidence-based treatments, CBT and TFCBT. The research consistently identified cognitive behavior therapy, or CBT, as one of the most effective treatments. CBT helps people identify unhealthy thinking patterns and replace them with healthier, more realistic beliefs into their lives. Another highly effective treatment is trauma-forced CBT, which combines trauma processing with emotional regulation skills. These studies also emphasize mindfulness, emotional regulation training, and supportive relationships as an important parts of recovery. Overall, this evidence shows that recovery is possible when individuals receive the appropriate treatment and support. Now, I'd like to summarize the most important findings of my capstone. Key findings. Right? Sorry. All right. Childhood emotional abuse has lasting effects that continue to adulthood. Across multiple studies, emotional abuse was consistently associated with emotional dysregulation, depression, and anxiety. At the same time, the literature that demonstrated that recovery is possible. Early intervention, supportive relationships, and evidence-based therapy can greatly improve long-term outcomes. These findings also have important implications for professionals working and children and families. Okay, now my final thoughts. Early recognition of emotional abuse is essential. Pretty much any trauma-informed care will improve the assessment and the treatment because it will help battle this type of disorders earlier into their lives and shape their behaviors, and throughout neuroplasticity and based treatment evidence help them into help them into become better adults. How does this happen? By increased education awareness that can reduce stigma. It has a childhood emotional abuse throughout this time has long term on their emotional regulation, and this affects influence the changes in the brains of these young adults, how they attach emotionally and their coping skills. However, the most encouraging findings is that healing is possible through therapy, and like I said, neuroplasticity and resilience, and supportive relationships through family and mentorship. Increasing awareness is essential for improving the future mental health outcomes. So, this concludes my presentation. I hope you have a wonderful day.